Libraries. You know them, you love them, and if you're anything like me, your late fees could buy 5 sandwiches, a discounted jacket, gas, whatever $33 can buy you. Libraries are great for holding lots of books, sort of like a shelf. What makes it better than the shelves in your home, though, is that a library is like a lot of long shelves that anybody can come into and check out any book they want. Public archives, including libraries, are necessary for any society that wants to preserve its cultural heritage. Now, they've been around for a long time. From the ancient Sumerians recording on the clay tablets, to ancient libraries, to modern libraries, to websites like Internet Archive. And though most of history has seen writing as the preferred way to keep track of anything that's worth noting, the recent emergence of digital media and all the information it carries has created the necessity to preserve the new format in a way that best suits it. It's also important that you understand the resources that an archive can provide you. And once you understand what an archive is, then their value, their function, and their importance can all be explained. So, what is an archive? Essentially, it's a big collection of records, and that could be anything from books, legal documents, film, music, or really any sort of information that's worth holding on to. Now, I'll be talking primarily about digital archives here, and so it's important that we brush up with some of their history. And the Vanderbilt Television News Archive is not only a mouthful, but a great place to start. On the 5th of August, 1968, the Vanderbilt Television News Archive recorded its first broadcast, marking the beginning of one of the longest-running television archives in America. Clifford B. Anderson, administrator of the archive and author of Preservation and Archiving of Digital Media, recounts the history and obstacles the Vanderbilt Archive has seen in over 50 years of operation. With a focus on televised news, the Vanderbilt Archive was created through the combined efforts of an insurance agent named Paul Simpson and Vanderbilt University's Director of Joint University Libraries, Frank Grisham. Initially recording a representative hour every day from ABC, NBC, and CBS, the archive would later include CNN and Fox. During its time in operation, the archive has recorded incredible moments in the news across a petabyte of data. All of their recordings come at a price though, like everything does, and in 1992 the archive was facing the threat of being shut down due to the $1.5 million in debt that they had accrued over the 7 years prior. Today, the contents of the archive are available to borrow digitally, although for a price. Of course, there exists a variety of archives outside of the one at Vanderbilt. In Beth Delaney and Annemieka de Jong's paper, Media Archives and Digital Preservation, Overcoming Cultural Barriers, we are introduced to these. As far as television archives go, the RAI of Italy has been broadcasting and archiving since 1954, citing cultural heritage as the primary driving force behind their efforts. BBC Scotland is in the practice of submitting their digitized recordings to the British Film Institute, which maintains the National Television Archive. Delaney further details hybrid archives, such as France's INA, which serve both cultural preservation and broadcasting needs, but her discussion of national libraries is where it really starts to get interesting. You see, compared to other archives, national libraries have the unique advantage of being backed by a government. The Royal Library of Sweden is particularly special because of a law that requires all internet-based media productions to have a copy submitted to the library. But because professional archives only really keep track of the things that most people would consider to be of real importance, and because they don't have the time or the resources to track down every piece of content ever uploaded to the internet, there isn't really much attention paid to the interactions that we have in our everyday lives. Abigail de Kosnik, author of the book Rogue Archives, and a related article, Piracy is the Future of Culture, identifies a new variety of librarian she refers to as the amateur archivist. Now, it's important to note that amateur only means that they are doing the work for free. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's low quality. To help understand what an amateur archivist is, though you can probably get a good idea from the name alone, de Kosnik breaks this down into two groups. First, there are fan archivists, who record and preserve the cultures of the small communities they belong to. Centered around a shared interest, these are often highly personalized and are made to reflect the humor, language, and principles of the group. The second group she calls pirate archivists. As you can likely guess, they preserve mass media productions like film, music, books, and more by way of downloading from the internet or ripping a legally purchased copy to illegally redistribute. Of course, this practice sits outside of the law and often has the side effect of killing producers and publishers' interest in having their works professionally archived, as they are too stubborn or hurt to acknowledge the difference between professional archivists and pirates. DeKosnik quotes audio archivist Samuel Brylowski. Record companies today feel bruised by the rampant swapping of music files propagated by programs such as Napster. In fact, copyright laws, particularly those enacted to reduce digital piracy, can now prohibit legitimate and necessary preservation functions. Really, this sort of attitude goes way back. Jack Valenti, former president of the Motion Pictures Association of America, was said to have likened technologies like VCR and the internet, which could be used to copy movies and TV shows, to disease, terrorism, and mass murder. Of course, cable companies today will sell you a DVR and charge you a monthly fee to record programming onto it, so clearly the issue isn't with revenue. It may, in fact, be with control over the media. Going back to Vanderbilt, they have a certain history with CBS. The first lawsuit CBS filed against Vanderbilt resulted in the implementation of a loaning program resembling a lending library, with copies of requested recordings being sent out and returned by the end of the month. The second suit was filed when the archive was preparing to publish an index of its recordings onto the internet. CBS took issue with this, and former Vice President Don DeCesare was adamant that there was only one side to the story. CBS controlled the content, and that was the end of it. He claimed, if we put something on the air, we stand behind it. But if someone else is duplicating it, editing it, and sending it out, we've been removed from that process. It is unclear how an unaltered recording of a news broadcast can qualify as edited, or why redistribution of that unchanged recording would be an issue if the broadcaster claims to stand behind it. Perhaps the real issue is that if the views held by the broadcasting company should change in any way that contradicts previous broadcasts, then the company will be unable to edit or strike those contradictions from the public record. Anyways, DeKosnik also stresses the importance of decentralization and how it benefits information repositories. Take the case of library.nu, also known as LNU, a large collection of pirated ebooks. The books were all hosted on a central set of servers, and once a court order came through to shut them all down, the books went with them. This likely could have been prevented, or at least resisted, had the LNU followed a decentralized hosting plan. You see, a decentralized setup means that if one server should go down for any reason, there are still multiple copies stored on other servers in other locations, and thus the content is preserved. This is the idea behind archive networks. A single node may be easily taken offline, but tackling the entire network is far more difficult. In the case of piracy networks, DeKosnik explains, even if these individual pirate archivists' hardware units filled up with films, TV series, books and articles, video games, and other media texts in the form of data files simply sit inert for many years, they will survive as cultural archives, provided they exist in a dry, relatively cool environment. Here, strength comes in numbers. While an institution such as the Library of Congress is likely to have many fail-safes and protective measures, those come at a large cost, while having hundreds or thousands of copies spread across just as many users' machines is far cheaper, especially when viewed on a cost-per-user level. For a short while now, I've had an interest in linguistics, particularly in the development and history of languages. And part of that history is it is difficult to imagine the death of a language and the shared sorrow of its last speakers, especially when the one I speak is so widely used. And so I often think about how a language might be preserved and what exactly needs to be recorded so that future generations can accurately reproduce it. Fortunately, Patrick McConville at the Australian National University has laid out just that. In his paper, published by the IASA, or International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, McConville's concern lies with dead and dying languages. He introduces us first to the idea of moribund languages, which are those that are not being effectively passed on to newer generations. He relays a quote from researcher Ken Hale, who describes a dead language as a catastrophe for human cultural and intellectual diversity. In regards to my earlier question, McConville clues us in into which elements of a language need to be recorded in order to construct an accurate portrayal. There is more to any language than just the written and spoken elements. You have to consider song, rhyme, its use in art, dialect, class differences, and a whole lot more. Music, McConville tells us, has a special connection to language. Between spoken and sung language, there are unique differences in the pitch, stress, duration, and volume of words and syllables. Within the broad category of music, there are relevant subcategories like poetry and chanting. He delves even deeper by defining the characteristics of a good corpus. If you don't know, a corpus is a collection of written and spoken material that defines how a language is used. He posits that a corpus should be diverse, large, ongoing, distributed, or more accurately, widely sourced, in that many people can contribute to its production. Opportunistic, taking every available chance to record. Ethical, in that the recording of the language should be in accordance with how the speakers want it to be recorded. Transparent, or easily understood. Preservable, portable, in the sense that it can be ported to various hardware and software media, though he adds that with modern technology, it would be possible to make it easily transportable as well. McConville sees all of these as requirements for the proper preservation of a language. He also takes care to list several initiatives that seek to catalog language corpora and make them available on the internet. I think that these standards and initiatives are all a large part of the puzzle of language preservation. You should know that even languages that are very much alive today exist in an ever-changing state. The English that was spoken by Shakespeare sounds incredibly antiquated to modern ears, and a few centuries before that, you would have heard something almost completely divorced from modern English. This is universally true, and every language has a long and complicated history throughout which it has been subject to intermingling with the languages of neighboring and invading groups, phonetic shifts, new slang, and countless other factors. While the changes in written languages over time have been incidentally kept through books, ledgers, laws, and similar documents, far fewer examples exist of how people spoke and how their speech changed with time. In considering bias, realize that for most of our recorded history, only appropriately educated persons were able to accurately record that history, and that is subject to even further biases. It makes sense to record the outcome of a decisive battle, but the little pieces that create an image of an entire culture aren't often included in that. Ledgers and receipts can give us an idea of the economy of a long-gone society, but speak little to their clothes, their art, their philosophy, their spirit. The names of many kings and their lands are lost to time because their records weren't properly maintained, and the only evidence of their existence was written down by those who arrived far too late to save them from a second death. Lower-class speech was scarcely recorded because of the bias that the necessary education was a historically expensive endeavor. A news broadcast might be lost because the only recording is destroyed or corrupted. On the internet, vaguely remembered movies and songs are deemed lost media all the time, in the hopes that some soul will recall a string of memories that leads them to the last remaining copy. It can be terrifying to think about all that has been lost, all that will be lost, how much of what you accomplish will be lost. Sure, in our current moment, our phones can be used to record much of our daily lives, no matter how mundane, but that responsibility falls on you, the individual, the citizen. Our leaders, our heroes, and our villains will have little trouble being remembered as they live on through documentation or word of mouth. But for the rest of us, there's a collective responsibility to remember, to be remembered. So take a picture. It'll last longer.